in 2017.
Right.
And
I was there.
Yeah, and I've been back a couple times, a few times at least since then. So not as much as some of the other candidates, especially the folks from the Midwest, but I've been around. I know, right?
We're good. You're ready? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. I'm Kathy Obradovich, opinion editor here at the Des Moines Register, and we're here with Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, a Democratic candidate for president. Welcome, Congressman.
Kathy, thanks very much. It's good to be here.
We also have some members of the Register editorial board and editors and reporters. Let's just briefly go around the room. We may have a few more join us as we are in progress, but go ahead.
I'm Carol Hunter, executive editor.
Rachel Stassenberger, politics editor. Reporter.
Okay. Well, Congressman, why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you want to be president?
Sure. So, first of all, I wouldn't be here today as a member of Congress, let alone running for president, if not for my time in the Marines. I served 4 tours in the Iraq War on the ground in the infantry, leading troops in combat. And when I was there, I felt like I saw the consequences of failed leadership in Washington. And in very personal and human terms, with guys who lost their lives because of bad decisions made in Washington, D.C. And I ran for Congress, taking on an 18-year incumbent in 2014 because I wanted to change that. I didn't want to see the mistakes I saw in Iraq happen again. So you might ask, okay, well then why did I get into the Marines? And for me, that comes back to the minister at my college church, who was the most important mentor I've ever had in my life. His name was Peter Gomes, and he talked a lot about the importance of service, about how it's not enough just to believe in service or support others who serve. You got to find a way to give back yourself. So I looked at different options. I looked at teaching overseas. I looked at doing the Peace Corps. But I had so much respect for these 18-year-old kids, some even younger than that, who serve on the front lines of our nation's military, that I decided that's where I wanted to do my part. I knew I wanted to be in the infantry. I didn't want to be riding in a truck while some 17 or 18-year-old was slogging through the mud next to me. But I had no idea that September 11th would happen 3 months after I graduated, that I'd end up in the 1st Company of Marines into Baghdad, or that I'd return for a total of 4 tours in that war. But in addition to seeing the consequences of failed leadership in Washington when I was in Iraq, I also felt like I saw the best of America in the worst of circumstances. And there's nothing that's been more inspiring in my life than serving with so many great Americans in the Marines. Even in the midst of a war that many of us disagreed with, a war that I was an outspoken critic of. I kept going back because I didn't want to see anyone go in my place. And my job, my fundamental job as a Marine platoon commander, was to take this remarkably diverse group of Americans, people from all over the country with different religious beliefs, different political beliefs, including a great corporal from Iowa, and get them all united behind a common mission to serve America. And I think that in many ways that is exactly the leadership experience we need from our nominee and from the next president of the United States in such a divided time. To bring Americans together, to build the coalition that we need to win this race that's got to include everybody in the Democratic Party. We can't leave anybody out. But also independents, those Obama, Trump voters, and even some disaffected Republicans. That's the coalition we're going to need to defeat this incumbent president. But it's also the coalition we're going to need to get anything done once we win. And I think that it's hard to build a group like that in such a divided time in our country, but I've done it in terribly divisive and difficult circumstances before. So when I looked at my 9-month-old daughter, who was, I guess, 3 months at the time that people started getting in this race, and I said, what can I do to best serve this country, to make sure that she grows up in a better world than we have today? I decided it was to run, because I think I'm the best nominee to take on Trump, and I don't think he's going to be easy to beat.
You mentioned consequences of failed leadership that you saw in Iraq. Can you be a little bit more specific about that? Is it just the fact that we were in Iraq in the first place, that we were there for so long without much of an end game, or what specifically?
Oh, there's a
did you
long
see?
list of things. It was going into Iraq without a plan, based on faulty intelligence, not asking the tough questions in Congress and in the White House about the weapons of mass destruction charges and everything else. It was invading the country successfully, but having no plan for the reconstruction. I was leading a platoon in the 1st Company of Marines into Baghdad, and a few months later I was running an Iraqi TV station because the State Department wasn't there to do that part of the reconstruction job. It was being unclear about how we get the country back together. We had this big debate about whether to divide it up, which I think would have been a mistake. But we clearly did not have a diplomatic plan. The country started to descend into civil war and fall apart, necessitating the surge. But then after the surge was remarkably successful at restoring order and advancing the politics in Iraq, we pulled out too quickly. We pulled out so quickly that we had to turn around and send troops back in under the Obama administration just a year later. So throughout the history of the Iraq War, we have not had a clear strategy. We've not had a clear mission that the troops can understand, this is what I need to do in order to come home, or at least it's been all over the map. And we've not resourced the war sufficiently to get that done. As a result, Americans lost their lives. I remember when they sent us like steel cutout doors to stop IEDs, to retrofit Humvees, because we were completely unprepared for that threat. And rather than investing the industrial might of the United States into immediately getting the armored vehicles that we needed, they just sort of, did the war on the cheap and sent us the steel cutout doors, even though it cost more American lives. So it was a repeated failure of the people in Washington to understand what's going on the ground. And I know a lot of Americans feel that way today. A lot of Americans feel that way in Iowa. Last night, Senator Hogg took me around Cedar Rapids where all the flood damage occurred. And he explained how the federal government used to invest in this kind of infrastructure, but they don't anymore. And even when they finally got together a plan to build up the levees and everything, the federal government only contributed 18%. So there are a lot of Americans who feel like Washington is out of touch with what's going on the ground. And that's certainly the way that I felt in Iraq.
Before we leave military, as Commander-in-Chief, would you change the considerations before you would send military somewhere else in the world?
Oh, of course.
So how would you change, say, compared to what the Obama administration did?
Well, first of all, I think it's significant that I'm the only candidate in this race for whom the first time I have to make a life or death decision involving the lives of young Americans and then live with the consequences of that decision won't be when I'm sitting in the Situation Room of the White House. I understand what it means to put lives on the line, to ask Americans to literally risk their lives, do something that might get them killed for the national security of the United States. And therefore, my bar is very, very high for asking them to do it. First of all, I believe in following the Constitution, which says that we need to have a debate in Congress about going to war. There are certain provisions under the War Powers Act for the Commander-in-Chief to respond to an immediate threat. But any long-term conflict should be debated and authorized by Congress, and I've been a consistent advocate for that in the Congress of the United States and sitting on the Armed Services Committee. I also think we need to have a much clearer strategy for what we're doing in all these wars across the globe. I would end the war in Afghanistan, but maintain a counter-terror presence and reinforce the diplomatic presence to make sure things don't go backwards like they did when we pulled out of Iraq. I would reinforce the diplomatic presence in Iraq. Trump, of course, has done the exact opposite, pulling our diplomats out of Baghdad, because the security situation in Iraq is okay, but they need a lot more help in forming a successful government so that things don't descend again, like when ISIS swept into the country. In Syria, we have no mission, no clear end state, no goal that the troops know they need to achieve in order to come home. I would focus on just supporting our allies in the southeastern part of the country and nothing else. Engage in 5 or 6 party talks with the other players in the region through the UN or through other auspices to try to figure out what the long-term state of Syria will be, but recognize that our national interest is much more narrow than the entire world. And more broadly, I would modernize not only our military, our arms and everything, but all the organizations around the world that help us maintain security to deal with threats from a new world. So a great example is NATO. Several other candidates in this race have said that Trump has dismantled NATO and we need to go back into NATO, but that's wrong, because NATO is not sufficient the way it is today. NATO was designed under a 1949 framework that never envisioned Russia would be attacking us not with tanks or missiles, but through the internet. And NATO can't respond. So we need to modernize NATO. We need to build a Pacific version of NATO to help formalize alliances between countries like South Korea and Japan that are allies of ours but don't get along well with each other, because we have a rising threat of China, and of course we have to contain the nuclear threat in North Korea. So there is a lot of work to do to modernize our approach to national security. And if we do it successfully, by engaging more in diplomacy, by divesting of the old clunky weapon systems we don't need anymore in favor of investments in things like cyber and artificial intelligence and space technologies, we'll also save a lot of money, which should be invested in the State Department. I'm, like many combat veterans, like General Mattis, someone who believes that if you cut the State Department budget, you're going to have to buy the Department of Defense more ammunition. And our strategy, our ultimate strategy as a country, should be to win wars without fighting them. That means winning them in advance through diplomacy. Of course, what we're doing right now is the exact opposite, which is fighting wars without winning them.
The other aspect of foreign policy that we're seeing under the Trump administration is a combination of isolationism from engagement in various ways, not militarily necessarily, but in other ways, but also this kind of go-it-alone approach to trade and trade disputes. How would you, especially when it comes to trade, which is a serious issue in Iowa, how would you manage that differently?
Well, first of all, the one thing I will give the administration credit for is that they're right to stand up to China, because China is a major economic and national security threat to the United States. But their tactics for going about it are all wrong. You know, throwing around a bunch of tariffs to look tough and try to get China to the negotiating table while you're just hurting American families and farmers and back home for me in Massachusetts, the fishermen as well, is not a way to get a successful trade deal. And especially not if your goal is simply to convince China to agree on paper to stop stealing our intellectual property, which is a real way that China is stealing American business ideas and military secrets and fundamentally American jobs through the internet every single day. One of the bills that I have in Congress is to sanction the producers of Chinese fentanyl, because it's the most deadly and most prevalent opioid on the street today. Something like 70% of the fentanyl comes from China. And the reason we have this bill to directly go after the producers of Chinese fentanyl is that we had an agreement back in 2014 between the United States and China to stop the shipment of this drug into America. But in the next year, from 2015 to 2016, there were about, I think, 1,204 shipments of fentanyl were stopped. I can get you that exact number, but I think that was the number. And out of those 1,204, 1,200 were stopped by U.S. Customs officials, 4 were stopped by China. So the point is that they agreed to stop shipping this stuff, but they didn't care. They didn't enforce it. And that's exactly what will happen if Trump gets some agreement that China will stop stealing our ideas through the internet. We can't count on them to agree on paper to stop stealing our businesses. We need to have adequate cyber defenses. And this administration has literally allocated more money for the concrete border wall down south than for cyber protection for the entire country. So their strategy is all wrong. Yes, we need to counter the Chinese threat, but we need to do it effectively. And throwing around tariffs that just hurt people back here at home is the polar opposite of what we should be doing.
You talked yesterday or over the weekend about impeachment. What are Democrats doing wrong here when it comes to dealing with the president, and what do you think impeachment hearings would accomplish?
I don't think we're doing nearly enough to simply stand up to him. I worked so hard over the last 2 years to win back the House. And of the 40 seats that we flipped to take back the House, over half of them, were supported candidates who I endorsed, recruited, campaigned for on the ground across the country through my Serve America organization. So I worked really hard to win back the House because I knew it was the best way that we could put a check on President Trump. But we're not doing enough of that because we refuse to take on, or our leadership at least, refuses to take on some of the toughest things that we have to do to hold this administration accountable, which includes having impeachment hearings. And our party leadership makes an articulate argument for why the politics might not be in our favor, and not a majority of Americans support impeachment. But how about just doing the right thing by the Constitution? That's how I think about this. I swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, not the politics of my party. And so I voted for beginning impeachment hearings way back in December of 2017. I was the first candidate in this race to not only say we should have this debate, but actually vote for it in Congress. And I said at the time, look, the politics are terrible. The timing is bad. I wish we had more information, but it's simply the right thing to do. And that's the point that I've been making for the last year and a half, that this is simply our constitutional duty, only reinforced by Robert Mueller's report, to have this debate. But to your question, to your second question, which is what will it accomplish? I think what it will do is it will open up the Trump administration to Congress and to the American people. Because most Americans haven't read the Mueller report. Most Americans haven't even read the executive summary to know just how bad this stuff is, and how Mueller served it up on a platter for Congress to take action.
Have you read the whole thing?
I have. So I have not read, every single footnote. But yes, I have a copy on my desk. It's big, it's daunting. But I have read through it, and I think it's the responsibility of every member of Congress to read through it as well. And as more members of Congress have read through it, more members have come over to my side on impeachment. No one has left my camp, okay? No one's saying, Seth, I used to support impeachment, but now I think he should just keep doing what he's doing. More and more Democrats every week are coming on the side of impeachment. And I think it's this recognition that increasingly, not only is it the right thing to do, but I think the politics will be in our favor. Because having this debate, exposing what's really going on in a way that just simply isn't getting through in this 600-page report, by bringing in members of the administration, by having testimony from people that we haven't heard from before, compelled under an impeachment inquiry process, that will bring to light a lot of the problems with this administration. And even if he's not convicted by the Senate, because the Senate is controlled by Republicans, having that debate right before we go into the 2020 election, I think that the politics are favorable for us on that count too. But at the end of the day, as I said before, it's not the politics that should dictate the decision. It's what our constitutional duty is. And I think that is very clear.
Regardless of whether you go through impeachment hearings, after the 2016 election, a lot of Democrats, especially here in the Midwest, concluded that it was a mistake for their party to focus so heavily on Donald Trump. Also the media focusing too heavily on Donald Trump, instead of offering a strong economic plan, especially for rural America. I mean, is history about to repeat itself here if the 2020 campaign's focused on Donald Trump and what he may or may not have done in 2015?
We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to do both. We have to present a positive vision for America, but we can't be afraid to take on the sitting president. At the end of the day, we've got to pick a nominee who can not only present a new vision for America, and I think it's time for a new generation of leadership to present that vision. It's why I've been not just talking about that, but fighting for it every single day since my first campaign. But we also have to have someone who can go toe-to-toe with him on the debate stage. And that's the only way we're going to win. So we as a party have to do both things as well. We have to hold this administration accountable while also working hard to present a positive vision for America. And that's what the Democratic Party has always been in the past. You know, we've taken on tough challenges before. We're the party that pulled us out of the Great Depression and led us through World War II. We're the party that tackled civil rights. You know, that was a hard fight, but we said we have to do this for America. We're also the party that sent a man to the moon. And we did those things about the same time. So we can tackle tough challenges in America. We can hold people accountable, as we did through the civil rights movement, while also presenting a positive vision for the future, as we did not only through that movement, but at the same time saying we're going to put a man on the moon.
You mentioned going toe-to-toe with Donald Trump on the debate stage, but you didn't make the debate the first time around. Are you going to make the debate the second time?
Well, look, the DNC establishment in Washington and who they decide qualifies for the debate is not ultimately going to decide this race. And I knew that getting in as late as I did, because I have such a young daughter at home, our first child for me and Liz, was a real risk. And indeed, I'm probably not going to make the first two debates. But we don't go to the polls or to the caucus rooms, until early next year. So that's still 6.5 months away. And the message that I have been delivering has been resonating on the ground, as it did at the corn feed yesterday. I can't tell you how many people came up to me after the speech and said, you know, Seth, to be honest, I don't know that much about you. I haven't heard as much about you because you were late in the race. But I was really impressed. And I had a bunch of people from the corn feed come over to my climate change forum that I did yesterday evening with Senator Hogg just to learn more and to find out more about my campaign. And that's the response I've been consistently getting wherever I go. So I recognize that it's always an uphill climb when you get in a race late and you're an underdog. But I've also been an underdog before. In my first campaign for Congress, I took on an 18-year incumbent. And the Massachusetts Democratic establishment quickly told this guy who didn't know much about politics that you're not supposed to do that. You know, they said, Seth, not only are you going to lose this race, but you'll never be involved in Massachusetts politics again because you dared take on the establishment. And what they were fundamentally saying to this young veteran was, do not participate in the democracy you risked your life to defend. And that's wrong. But I will admit, they were right about how it was a tough race. And we did our first poll after 7 months on the campaign trail. Mind you, I've only been in this race for 2.5 months. But after 7 months on the campaign trail in my first race, I was only 53 points down. Which for anybody watching who doesn't know about politics, that's not good. That's very, very bad. Okay? My own pollster told me it was statistically impossible to win and that I should quit. But again, the response I was hearing on the ground was different. So we made some changes. I mean, I didn't ignore the poll. I said, okay, maybe we need to take some different approaches here, but we kept working at it and kept meeting voters where they are. And I won that primary by 11 and then won a general election by 14 in a district that voted by 13 points for our Republican governor, so 27-point spread. And that is exactly what we need to do in this race. I mean, win a tough primary with some incredibly talented fellow candidates that I'm proud to be in the race with. But then also win, I think, a real tough general election. I don't think Donald Trump is going to be easy to beat. And if I honestly believed that there was another potential nominee out there in the race that I could just get behind because he or she would be better at going toe-to-toe with Trump on the debate stage, then that's what I would do because it's the right thing for the country. And it would also be easier on my family.
Could you talk a little more about your strategy and how it's resonating on the ground and how by February 3rd you'll be one of the top 3, let's say? You know, if the DNC measures small dollar donors and polling, you know, you're not on the debate stage. You've
Well,
been
we've
to
actually
Iowa a few times, but not as much as some. So just
Sure.
sort of explain how it would work.
So sure. So we've actually qualified by their polling criteria 9 different polls. They've just chosen not to count those polls. So I mean, I don't know what they're thinking or what their strategy is in Washington and the DNC. But we're doing okay, and we're polling even with you know, a number of the senators, for example, who've been in this race a lot longer than I have. In terms of small dollar donors, I think it's important to keep in mind that that doesn't represent the entirety of the Democratic Party. And I was speaking at a black church in South Carolina a few weeks ago, and all these different families wanted pictures with me and all that. And as I was taking pictures, I asked some of them, if you want, go ahead and post this on Facebook because it's helpful. And they looked at me and they said, we don't have Facebook. So there are a lot of people who are not plugged into this world of small dollar donors, who are the kind of voters that we need to bring along, that we need to win over if we're going to win this race. When I was getting breakfast in the hotel this morning, a black couple came up to me, and I kind of ran into them, and I said, "Oh, wait, I know who you are," and I said, "Oh, I'm Seth Moulton, I'm the Marine vet running." He said, "Oh, no, we know, we need you." And then she said, the woman said something that was very telling and very candid, which I really appreciated. She said, "You're doing good, but you need to be doing better. Because we need you," she said. "We need you." And she said, you got our votes, we're behind you, but look, I recognize that as she does, there's a steep hill to climb here. But I'm going to just keep doing this to keep resonating on the ground. Now, we have a lean campaign. I don't have paid supporters all over the state. I get that, but that's okay. There have been plenty of other presidential candidates who have been where I am at this point in the race. I think Jimmy Carter was at 0.75% or something, and gotten to where we need to go. I think what's important is that the fundamentals here are strong, and people see that.
So how will we know when you've gone from doing good to doing better? What if not polling or money or small dollar donors, how would we measure that?
Well, I mean, I think we'll start to see it in the response on the ground, and obviously it eventually has to be reflected in the polling. I mean, I'm not naive here. I get the fact that we've got to move up, but our progress in the polls since I got in 2.5 months ago has been all positive. It's been great. It's just there's a big field out there, and it takes some time to break out, but that's okay.
For Kathy's first question, you started talking about foreign policy, which has not been talked about quite as much as in some presidential years. How do you make that connection to people that foreign policy is such an important focus for the next president?
Well, there are two things. First of all, the fundamental job of the commander-in-chief is to keep us safe. And I don't think Donald Trump is doing that. When you're cozying up to some of our worst enemies in the world, people who want to annihilate and even have the ability to annihilate America, like Vladimir Putin, or Kim Jong-un in North Korea, who certainly would like to annihilate the United States of America and has made that clear. When you're at the same time abandoning our allies and alienating them across the globe, you're not keeping America safe. And we've had a history of Democratic and Republican presidents who, one after the other, has been willing to stand up to the Russian threat. Trump trusts Vladimir Putin over every American intelligence agency. And that's the most unmistakable conclusion of the Mueller report is not just the obstruction of justice charge, but the fact that Putin and Russia, the only country on earth that could wipe out every American life in 20 minutes, they wanted Donald Trump elected president, and every American, whether you're the biggest Trump supporter or the biggest Trump hater, every American should want to know why. So the first reason is I don't think that Donald Trump is keeping us safe, and that's a core responsibility if you're Commander-in-Chief of the United States. But the second piece of this is that if you ask Democrats what's important in this race, the number one issue is not just healthcare or climate or the economy, it's beating Donald Trump. And I think that this is where he's weakest as Commander-in-Chief. So we've got to be able to take him on, not just as president, but as Commander-in-Chief, and make a case to the American people for why a Democratic president can do better. And that means that we've got to have a national security strategy that will make America strong and safe. We'll not just say, oh, we're spending too much money and we've got to withdraw from here and we've got to withdraw from there, although sometimes that is true, that we're spending too much money and sometimes we're overextended. But I want to talk about how we will make America stronger and safer and more secure than it is under this Republican president.
You talked about saying that you would withdraw from the active fight in Afghanistan, but that sort of sounds like Iraq again and Afghanistan, where we've built up, then we've drawn down, and then built up and drawn down. So what are sort of your tripwires for saying, okay, we can pull troops out, and what would trip you to say, no, we've got to put them back in?
Well, what I specifically said is that we have to end the war in Afghanistan insofar as it's an ongoing war, but not eliminate a counterterror presence. We have to have a continued counterterror presence. And I also specifically said we have to do that to avoid not repeating the mistake that we made in Iraq. But a big component of this, something we failed to do completely in Iraq, is reinforcing the diplomatic presence in Afghanistan. Because if you think about what happened when Iraq fell apart, ISIS swept into western and then northern Iraq, but they didn't actually defeat the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army put their weapons down and went home because they lost faith in their government. So the biggest failure in Iraq was not just withdrawing the troops, which actually Crocker and Petraeus said you could start to do. It was failing to reinforce the diplomatic presence, which both Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus said had to go hand in hand with withdrawing troops. And as a result, the Iraqi government frayed. It started to fall apart. Their own army lost faith in them, and ISIS was able to sweep in and take care over the country. It's also one of the reasons, by the way, why when President Obama responded to this by simply sending in more Americans to train Iraqi troops, I said that's not what we need. That can be part of the solution, but what we really need is to get the Iraqi government back on track. So to the question that you asked, which is a very important question, it's a very good question, is we need to have a continued counterterror presence in Afghanistan so that something like September 11th doesn't happen again, which is a risk. But we don't need to have an ongoing nation-building war. We do need to reinforce the diplomatic presence in Afghanistan because the government is shaky. It's okay, but it's shaky. And those are the things that we have to keep an eye on. There's a great debate to be had about, what do you do about the progress that we've made in civil society in Afghanistan, like the girls who are able to go to school now. And I want to continue seeing girls go to school, but I don't want to have 130,000 troops in Afghanistan to accomplish it.
How would you reform the VA?
Do we have another 2 hours, or? So
It's not as simple as
it is not,
saying you can
it is
go
not
to
simple.
whatever doctor you want.
It's not simple, but it is incredibly important. And my perspective on healthcare in this race is kind of unique because I'm the only candidate who actually gets single-payer healthcare, or at least the closest analogy we have to single-payer healthcare, because I made a commitment to continue going to the VA, even as a member of Congress. And I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of care at the VA. So let me just share a little bit about my own experience. The good is that there are some things the VA does pretty well, like the VA negotiates prescription drug prices, which Medicare does not. So I get lower prescription prices at the VA than people on Medicare. But we've also heard the stories of veterans dying on waiting lists or literally committing suicide in VA waiting rooms because they can't get the mental health care that they need. I got surgery at the VA a couple years ago, and they sent me home with the wrong medications. And that's not the kind of healthcare system that I want to force you to have. That's why I'm for healthcare for everybody and a public option like President Obama always wanted as a part of Obamacare, even though that's not what Congress passed. But I'm not for forcing everybody into a Medicare for all system where that's the only choice you have, a government plan designed in 1963. I think we can do better than that. Specific to the VA, one of the reasons why the VA has trouble is there is no competition for it. No one is competing for me as a patient. The VA, frankly, would be happy if I were to go. There's no incentive for them to hang on to me, and they're not trying, other than when Congress makes them, to get veterans to come on board. So that's very different than a public option competing against other healthcare systems, where I could make a choice to either continue going to the VA or to take another government plan, or to go to a plan in the private sector, depending on who had the lowest costs and the best outcomes, and that's a decision that I could make as a consumer. And that competition, like with every other industry in America, helps bring down prices. And
Doesn't that, though, undermine the mission of the VA to understand the unique needs of veterans?
No, it doesn't.
Are not.
No, it's a fair question, but no, it doesn't. Because there are already a lot of veterans who have the resources to afford a private plan and don't go there, and yet the VA is still able to do its job. So the VA, look, this is the way veterans feel about the VA. Veterans want the VA reform, but they don't want to see it privatized and go away. And a big part of that is, like you say, the fact that the VA, with this unique patient population, is able to focus on our needs. But it's also true that they're not doing a good enough job, because one of the needs of veterans coming back is mental health care. It's something I've talked about in this race when I apparently became the first candidate in presidential history to talk about my own experience with post-traumatic stress. Even though there are plenty of other presidents like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant and probably Dwight Eisenhower and George Bush, if you look at their writings, who've dealt with these issues as well, coming back from war, or just throughout their lives, in Lincoln's case. But I talked about it because I said, if I'm applying for the top leadership position in the country, then I shouldn't be afraid to lead by example and share my own experience. But I also talked about it because I've seen the effect that it has on fellow veterans. And just since I shared my own story of dealing with post-traumatic stress and moving past it, I can't tell you how many veterans have come up to me across the country and shared their own stories of dealing with mental health. Some of them sharing stories that they say, they said, Seth, I've never told anyone this since it happened in Vietnam. And yesterday at the corn feed, a mother and father came up to me and talked for 5 or 10 minutes about their own struggle with mental health in their family, and how much it meant that I was willing to share my story and then propose a very aggressive mental health care plan for the entire country, to start with veterans and active duty troops and really set the example for everybody else, as the military has often done, but then extend it to every high school in the country. And that's just an example of where the VA is not living up to its mission, where it has an opportunity to provide for the unique resources of veterans, but it's not doing a good enough job.
Let's talk a little bit about healthcare in a broader way. Like you said, you've proposed adding a public option to the Affordable Care Act. Vice President Biden came out with his plan this morning to do the very same thing. It sounds like maybe you've noticed some differences between your plans.
So I actually haven't seen the Vice President's plan, if it just came out this morning yet. But I mean, there's 24 of us, 25 of us in this race, right? So I mean, I'm sure that there will be some overlap. But I do think that this is the best option. And when I hear Americans and when I go out and talk to them, a lot of them are initially excited about the idea of Medicare for all, because Medicare has a good reputation. But as soon as you start explaining that means you're going to have to be forced out of your private plan if you have one, or if you are a part of a union that worked hard for years to fight for a better health care plan, you're going to be forced to give it up. That's not what people want. Imagine if I'm the next president and the first thing I do is I come in and say, okay, we have this healthcare thing. We also have this postal service thing, right? And you know what? We're going to get rid of FedEx and UPS. They're no longer going to be allowed to be in business. Does anyone actually think that lack of competition, where now everyone has to go to the Postal Service, would actually improve service at the Postal Service? I mean, I don't think so. That competition has been good for the system. And if people have choices for delivering their packages, I think they should have choices for the delivery of healthcare, which is obviously much more important.
Some Democrats argue that without Medicare for all, in other words, while you still have private insurance companies that essentially make money out of taking premiums and denying health care, that you're not going to have universal health care. How do you respond to that?
Well, it is a shared Democratic principle that a principle of our party, that health care is a human right, that everybody deserves health care. And just as President Obama believed, I believe you can get there with a public option. I'm not saying that anybody should be excluded from that. All I'm saying is that if you want to choose a private plan, you can. And those plans will compete for your business. And that ultimately will improve not only the private plans, force them to lower their prices, but also improve the public plan as well. I mean, for example, if we started with Medicare for all and it were truly competing against the VA and against other options, I mean, I think Medicare would figure out how to negotiate prescription drug prices. You know, I mean, I think that's something that they should be doing, because I can tell you it's better at the VA where they do. And I understand that means some law change and everything, but the point is that competition is healthy for the system.
The idea of the Affordable Care Act exchanges was to have competition, but in states like Iowa, there's very little choice there, and insurers who started off in the exchanges are no longer competing. How can you be sure a state like Iowa would have any competition, and would it just be the public option?
Well, first of all, you have to preserve some of the guidelines set up by the Affordable Care Act, like the protections against discriminating against folks with pre-existing conditions. Those protections were set in place to make sure that everybody has a level playing field, and that certain insurers couldn't just cherry pick healthy patients. Leaving others with fewer options. So,
do you keep a mandate in place for having insurance?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. You have to have whether it's the public option or private insurance. Everybody has to have insurance. That absolutely is it's the core part of the plan. And and look, even conservatives, agreed. I mean, the Affordable Care Act was largely based on an original proposal from the Heritage Foundation. So conservatives understand that this is necessary. They just are trying to play politics with it and change their point of view. But that's the first thing: is you have to have those guardrails put in place. Having a public option, and maybe even having more than one public option, is something that will help as well. But you're right that it is a real problem. In Massachusetts, there is much more competition among different healthcare plans, and that has helped lower prices in Massachusetts, and it improves outcomes, and more Massachusetts people are insured than folks here in Iowa. So making sure that market works is better. But to get back to my core point, you're not saying that, things are a lot better in Iowa because there's less competition. No, things are worse here because there's less competition. And I want to make sure we increase competition or preserve it as we make sure more Americans are insured.
The Affordable Care Act made more strides toward coverage for mental health, but there's still a lot of problems, including in states like Iowa, where authorization gets denied through the insurance. Access is a serious issue. So what else needs to be done for mental health?
So the Affordable Care Act pushed this idea called, what the experts call parity, which means that getting mental health care is no different than getting physical health care. And it really should be the same. I mean, you think about it, like, why is it such a big deal to get care for something going wrong up here and not for, breaking an elbow or something down here, right? I mean, these should be the same. It's all part of your body, but there's a stigma against seeking mental health care, and we've got to end that stigma. So the core goal of my mental health care plan is not only to just improve access to mental health care for Americans, but to remove the stigma against receiving it. So that's why I start with active duty troops. Because a lot of people look up to active duty troops and say, well, if that tough guy can get mental health care, then I can too. That's where we start, making sure that everybody who returns from a combat deployment gets a mental health screening within 2 weeks of getting home. And it becomes a standard that just like you get an annual physical, you get an annual mental health care screening. So it's just a natural thing to do whether you're sick or not. No one says to you, why are you going to get an annual physical if you're not sick? You don't have a cold or you don't have a broken leg. But we know now in America that there's just a healthy thing to do, to check in with your doctor. And maybe the doctor says, look, you're totally fine, but are you eating healthfully? Are you exercising? Well, that should be the same discussion that you have with a mental health care professional as well. Someone who says, okay, you're here for your annual checkup. I don't see any problems, but have you thought about practicing meditation? That's something that elite troops in our military are doing now because it makes them better at their jobs. Have you considered doing yoga? Are you getting the sleep that you need? Because all these things contribute to both mental and physical health. So after establishing that standard for our active duty troops and for our veterans, we would extend that to every high school across the country, where an increasing share of high schoolers everywhere in America are dealing with mental health issues, from school shootings to social media, increased anxiety. And then even like what I saw in Cedar Rapids yesterday, which is that the local officials said a lot of people had mental health issues because, understandably, their homes were swept away in the floods. So mental health issues mental health touches every American in this country, whether it's directly because you have something to deal with yourself or you have a family member or a friend. And so we've just got to get rid of the stigma and establish it as a standard. And if you go to get an annual mental health screening in high school, regardless of whether you feel you need it, and that can become a standard that is set for the rest of your life.
Can you talk a little bit more about your mental health screenings in high school? Who would do those? Who would pay for them? It would be an unusual role for the federal government rather than having states control what's in their schools. How would you fund them?
Well, I think that it should be I do think it should be funded by the federal government because we have a history in our education system of the federal government telling you to do things and not providing any funding for it. And I released my tax plan last week. That will raise the money to more than cover this and a whole bunch of other things as well. And so do you want me to go through my tax plan? Because that's how I would pay for it.
So it would be a federally funded mandate?
Correct.
So right now there are, as I'm sure you know, there are very few health counselors, not as many health counselors and mental health counselors in high schools. Would the federal government mandate that every high school have a mental health counselor to do
Well,
this training?
I wouldn't be so I wouldn't be so strict as that. I think you need to be flexible, and there are some small schools that would just have someone who can come in from the outside. For bigger schools, it might make sense to have someone fully on staff.
So would it be a block grant to schools to provide this service?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically the system that you would use. I mean, you would have some discretion, but it will be a federally funded mandate.
We touched just briefly, you mentioned the border and
Yes.
the border wall. What specifically do you think actually needs to be done for border security? And do you feel like that issue could ever be addressed separately from comprehensive immigration reform? Or is it politically just
I think that it could be addressed separately, but politically that would not be a smart thing to do. But I'm a Democrat who's not afraid to say that border security is an issue and that we have a crisis at the southern border. And it's a humanitarian crisis because we have kids in cages and women drinking out of toilets to survive. But it's also a crisis because we simply have more migrants coming from Central America than ever before. And we don't have a plan to deal with them. So yes, we need comprehensive immigration reform, and here's what I would do. First of all, I would improve border security, but not by building this silly concrete wall that people can just climb over, but by actually focusing on the ports of entry where there are too many drugs and illegal immigrants coming through. The second thing I would do, let me just say it. The first thing I would do is I would stop putting kids in cages and separating families on day one. So let me just not gloss over that on day one. And I wouldn't wait for some law to be changed by Congress. I would on day one stop that from happening. The second thing I would do is, yes, we do need to improve border security, but we need to focus on where it's needed most. Third, we need to have more asylum judges. And I'm not talking about a handful more, 50% more. I'm talking about like 5 times as many as we have today. Because justice delayed is justice denied. And if a family comes over to the United States legally seeking asylum because they fear for their lives back at their home country, then we need to give them an answer and we need to do it quickly. This is what Germany has done actually pretty successfully. I think their standard is, actually now I'm forgetting what it is, but it's way lower than ours, but ours should be even lower than theirs. Do you remember what Germany's standard is, Matt?
12 weeks.
It's 12. I think it's either 8 or 12 weeks, I think. But we should be trying to do it in 2 or 3. You know, these people are coming. If they don't qualify for asylum, let's tell them that right away before they get ingrained in American society and say, I'm sorry, but you don't qualify legally, so you have to go home. But if they do qualify, then let's get them immediately integrated into our economy, getting jobs, paying taxes like all the rest of us, and not just going on welfare. So that's something that we can do immediately to meet this crisis.
How much does the crush of asylum seekers at the border stem from just the lack of any legal other means for people to come into the country? I mean, would we have so many asylum seekers if somebody who had an opportunity to come legally to get a job, who didn't have to wait for years and years and years.
No, we wouldn't, but we've always had limits on immigration. Like that, a country's a country because it has borders, and those borders are enforced. And throughout history, we've had limits on legal immigration. So sure, if you just blew up those limits, people could just come that way. But that's not really the point. The point is that we have an unprecedented number of people seeking asylum because of the chaos in Central America. And that's why the fourth point of my plan is to invest in Central America to stop this problem at its heart. Of course, the Trump administration has done the exact opposite, pulling aid out of Central America. We need to take the model of Plan Colombia, which is, none of these things are perfect. Foreign aid is tricky. But Plan Colombia was pretty successful at turning a narco state into an American tourist destination in like 15 years. That's the model that we need to use, adapt it to Central America, and go in there and start helping them get some law and order so people aren't getting raped and murdered and fleeing for their lives. That's the fundamental solution to this crisis, stopping it where it starts.
There's a lot of issues left, and we started a little late,
Can
so
I just-
we're going to go a little longer. But I want to make sure that you.
Can I just say one more
Sure.
quick thing on immigration,
Sure.
which is really important. There are a lot of foreign students coming here. There's an extraordinary number of Chinese students at the University of Iowa, for example. And what we do is we bring all these Chinese students over. China's our biggest global competitor. And Chinese students know that American institutions of higher education are better. They don't have a University of Iowa in China. So they all come here to get educated. And then as soon as they learn all our stuff, we say, you have to go back to China to use it. It's so stupid. If you want to come here to study, then you should stay here. We should encourage you to stay here. I want you to use that knowledge that you gained for our benefit, for our country, for our economy, for our national security, not to compete against us in China. So that's another thing that's just completely backwards about our immigration system. And it's something that we can see happening right here.
So would you have a preferential visa program for people who studied here to stay here, or a
Yes.
green card system?
Yes, we can debate exactly what the details of it would be, but essentially, yes. I want those people to be encouraged to stay here and to help us grow our economy, not compete against us back in China.
I want to give you a chance to address climate.
Yes.
How can you sort of bridge the polarization that people feel?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And it's something that I've dealt with in Congress. I'm a member of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, which you can only join if you get a Republican to join with you. And so it's not always easy to convince a Republican to come over. But I have, and I'm a proud member of that caucus. And one of the ways that... we've gone through a couple actually, because the first was Carlos Curbelo, who then left. But Carlos and I worked on a lot of issues, and one of the ways that, just as an example, that we found common ground was we both represent coastal communities. So we see the real effects of rising oceans. So the strategy that you use to reach out to people across the aisle or from a different political ideology as you is to find places where you can agree, not always have these debates over things where you're just not going to get on the same page. And rising oceans is one. Rising floodwaters is another, because there are a lot of communities represented by conservative Republicans in Congress who are suffering from the flooding that's getting out of control, as you've seen here in Iowa. Another is national security. And there are massive national security implications of climate change. The Department of Defense knows this. They acknowledge it. They are adapting their strategy to deal with it. I was on a congressional delegation trip to Asia, and we stopped to refuel in Alaska a year or two ago. And we stopped over at this base where climate change was not on the agenda. And we later learned that, the general did not disclose his own political affiliation, but he did mention over dinner that his wife was the head organizer for Trump in the area. So you can imagine where his views lay. But at the end of the meeting, after we'd gone through the agenda about North Korea and Russia and things like that, he said, I gotta say one more thing. I don't care what you believe about where climate change comes from. I just got to tell you, it's happening, and it's a real threat to us because now Russia can get to us in ways they never could before. And so here's a conservative Republican Air Force general, from all I could tell, who just said, look, I don't care what you believe, like, it's happening. Of course, I said to him, you should care how it started because that's how we fix it, and the science is very clear on this, and we can have that debate. But the point is, this is real, and the national security implications are a way to reach people on the other side of the aisle.
Is it a mistake for other members of your party to set themselves up essentially to be called socialists for their approach to climate change?
Yes, it is a mistake, and I was one of the first people to sign on to the Green New Deal, but that was when it was an open framework. And when they started adding things like a guaranteed jobs program, that really takes away from the core message here, which is that this should be a climate issue. This is a climate issue, not a jobs and a healthcare and everything else issue. And by putting all these things, piling all these things on, it makes it easier to throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, okay, we're not going to do this because it's socialism. We should grow our economy by addressing climate change, not have it be a big cost on the American economy. And we can do that if we become the world leader in green technology. So I don't like the fact that when you install solar panels in the United States today, they're almost all manufactured in China. We should be selling the most advanced solar panels in the world to China, not the other way around. And that applies with all the other technologies that we need to develop to meet this crisis, both technologies for the developed world to create carbon-free energy, not just solar and wind, but things like next-generation nuclear, even fusion power, which can be totally safe and is like the holy grail that scientists have sought for decades, but actually is a lot closer if you talk to the folks at MIT right now than people think, and it's imperative that we win that race, not China. But also carbon-free energy solutions for the developing world. Because some of the conservative critics of the Paris Accord are right, which is that it doesn't do enough to address developing world contributions to climate change. And it is a massively increasing percentage. The way to deal with that is not just develop, plants for big electrical grids, but carbon-free systems that can go into villages and provide localized power. But again, let's develop that here in America and grow American jobs with American ideas, with American companies that sell those technologies to the rest of the world, not letting China get ahead of us. There was an interesting question last night at the Climate Change Forum about just the consequences of Trump, reducing the fuel standards for automobiles. And it's a real double-edged sword because, of course, the environmentalists are upset about the fact that you're just encouraging people, or you're encouraging American companies to produce cars that pollute more. But the bigger issue is that, well, I don't know if the bigger, but just as big an issue, is the fact that these American cars aren't going to be as competitive because we're not developing the electric vehicle technologies, or we're not pushing that development as much as some of the other countries in the world if we just say, oh no, it doesn't matter anymore. And at some point, if China is pushing these standards and America is not, then we're going to find ourselves buying electric cars from China because they're more advanced than the ones that are produced here in America, and that would be a massive mistake.
I wanted to just touch base quickly about rural America. Green technology, of course, is part of the farm economy here
Yes.
in Iowa. But what else would you do to make sure that rural America it has job opportunities, is not, as it is in Iowa, just emptying out because people can't find work. There are fewer and fewer farms, and people can't afford to keep the farms running. So what would you do essentially for rural America?
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of divides in America today. Divides that Trump and others are playing into and are deepening. And one is the political divide we've been discussing a lot between Democrats and Republicans, but another is the divide between urban and rural America. And it is getting worse. And we need to recognize that part of bringing this country together is bridging that divide as well. It's one of the reasons why I have the most ambitious national service plan of anyone in this race, but really of anyone since like FDR in the 1930s, challenging every one of the 33 million Americans between 17 and 24 to consider serving their country. And to be clear, this is not through expanding the military. This is civilian service opportunities. And one of the new opportunities I would inaugurate in my administration is a federal Green Corps. And the idea of a federal Green Corps is to put young Americans to work serving their country by making it more climate resilient, improving energy efficiency in buildings, doing carbon farming and helping farms across America become more carbon neutral, or even carbon negative, which I think is a huge opportunity for Iowa. We were talking about this at the Climate Change Forum last night. By strengthening our levees, by improving our seawalls and whatnot, but also by teaching skills that will be useful for the green economy. There are some buildings that can be weatherized to improve energy efficiency as part of this program, but then there's a great market for that in the rest of the country as well. There's also a real important opportunity here with wireless technology and 5G, because we've heard the stories about all the cool things that we're going to be able to do with this next generation in cellular technology, like driverless cars. They rely on that technology. But 5G requires towers that are much closer to each other than the existing 4G system. So it requires a lot more towers. So no one wants to talk about this, but here's the reality. Places that don't have 4G cell service right now, under current plans, they're absolutely not going to have 5G. So there's going to be this increasing technology divide, not just between people who have fast internet access or no internet access or slow internet access, but literally there's all these technologies that will rely on 5G cell service that simply will not be available in rural communities. And the US government cannot let that happen. That will only deepen this divide. So the private companies have already made it clear they're not going to invest in 5G in rural communities. The federal government needs to step in. And imagine having a whole bunch of young people serving their country by bringing 5G to rural communities. Just like under the Tennessee Valley Authority, we brought electricity to rural communities. And learning those skills, those technical skills that will be really valuable in the new economy. It will also just bring Americans together like I experienced in the Marines. And I have friends from across this country with different backgrounds and beliefs and whatnot that I never would have met if not through that shared experience. One of the keys here, one of the underlying themes is access to jobs. And the reality is today that there's more access to jobs in urban centers than there is in rural communities. So improving broadband access and fundamentally making sure that 5G is available in rural communities is one thing that we can do. Bringing job opportunities to people across America, whether you grow up in a city or you grow up on a farm, through national service is a second thing that we can do. A third thing is improving our transportation system. I'm a big believer in high-speed rail, not just because I like fast trains or China has fast trains, but because it improves job access across the country. If you had high-speed rail between Des Moines and Chicago, you could actually commute for a job there and come back at the end of the day. Now, I'm not saying that we want everyone to do that, but you should have the opportunity to do that if that's where the best job is. And there are stops along the way that would give you access to either Des Moines or Chicago in the process. That's the kind of 21st century infrastructure we need to invest in. So all the candidates will talk about how important infrastructure is, and they'll all talk about rebuilding roads and bridges. But we got to think way beyond that. We got to think about 21st century infrastructure that gives access to the internet, that gives access to jobs, that is truly able to be competitive for the rest of the world. There's a reason why China has an urban-rural divide as well. You know, they have vast parts of the country that do not have access to cities. There's a reason why they're investing so much in high-speed rail.
I just want to give you 1 minute to wrap up or
Sure.
bring up one more topic that we didn't ask you about. We're just about done. So
I just want to
1
say,
minute.
look, I just want to say that it's an honor to be here. And we're running a lean campaign, so I haven't been in Iowa as much as some of the other candidates. And I know I got in late because of my amazing daughter at home, my 9-month-old first child. But I'm really proud to be in this race, and the reception I've gotten in Iowa just in this weekend has been fantastic. And I'm in this race because I think it is incredibly important that we beat Donald Trump, and I don't think it's going to be easy to do. I have the unique experience of having led Americans in some of the most divisive circumstances on earth and building the kind of coalition that includes a lot of different people from different backgrounds and bringing them together in a common belief that America is a great country, and it's so great that we should be willing to serve it. And if I'm fortunate enough to be the next president, that's exactly what I will ask of all of you, of all Americans, is to believe in America so much that you're willing to serve the country in our own different ways, being a part of building a better future. So you don't hear me promising as much free stuff as some of the other candidates. You don't hear me pandering to this side or that. I'm just someone that you can trust. I'm someone who believes in this country, who's as big a patriot as you've ever met, and someone who wants to inspire that belief and service in others.
All right, Congressman Moulton, thank you
Thanks.
so much for being here today. And thanks to all of you for watching. Please come back to DesMoinesRegister.com for more information about this candidate interview and upcoming interviews, and also all the news about the Iowa caucuses.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
All right.
All right.
That's great. Thank you very much, too.
Yes.
Yeah, and thanks.
You are still mic'd.
I'm still mic'd. We won't say anything crazy.
Well, I think the sound's not up. I just didn't want you to.
Don't drag the mic away.
Great seeing you.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Here's me in case